Award-winning poet and critic and curator, John Yao has published over 50 books of poetry, fiction, and art criticism. John was a professor, recently retired, right, John?
Yes.
What? Professor of Critical Studies at Mason Gross School of Art at Rutgers University. After writing for Art in America and Art Forum, he served as the arts editor of the Brooklyn Rail from 2006 to 2011, and then began writing for Hyperallergic Weekend. He was the recipient of the 2018 Jackson Poetry Prize. In 2021, Yao was awarded the Rabkin Prize for Excellence in Visual Arts Journalism. His books of art criticism include The Realm of Appearances, The Art of Andy Warhol, and A Thing Among Things, The Art of Jasper Johns. If you were not able to attend last night's opening reception, the exhibition, Disguise the Limit, John Yao's Collaborations, is on view through December 14th. Please join me in welcoming John Yao and Stuart Horodner.
Now what are we supposed to do? I'll let him start. He knows everything. I'm just the puppet.
So I have a question. How many, has anybody in the room had a chance to see the exhibit across the way? Okay. This is sort of standard know your audience activity. How many of you are students? Okay. How many of you are faculty?
Oh, God.
Okay. Everybody else is an art lover of one stripe or another? Okay. How many of you have ever read any of John's writing, criticism or poetry? Okay, super. So I'm talking to informed folks. I said to Scott when we had this opportunity to do a talk that I really wanted to help serve whatever his goals were for the gathering, for the exhibit, wanted to help the museum crew be able to know how to talk about the exhibit for various visitors. And I guess given the nature of, this kind of today's conversation, we could wander into any number of areas. John and I have done a couple of these talks before, but I'm really interested in being able to give you content that you're interested in. I think we should just address ourselves to collaboration in general, John's collaborations in particular. And so maybe as a way of starting off that conversation, I guess, well, a couple of years ago I brought John to the University of Kentucky and asked him to give a talk on the history of poet and painter collaborations. Going back as far as he wanted to go, he pretty much was talking about the modern into the contemporary era. In many cases was talking about Europe, but for the most part, America. And maybe I could just ask you as a first question, when and how did you become aware of the collaborations that you're part of in terms of a legacy of not just poet-painter or poet-artist collaborators, but like yourself, poet-critic collaborators? So Frank O'Hara, John Ashbery, writers in New York who were friends with artists, who were known poets in their day, who were writing criticism as a way of making money on some level. But when and how did you become aware of that as a young person, and what was interesting about it to you?
I was probably 19 or 20. I was at Bard College. A man came by. He was a sculptor named Jacob Grossberg, and he saw me reading Pablo Neruda. We started talking, and then he said to me, poets, you don't want to teach. Poets can make a living being an art critic in New York City. I was like, oh, okay, what is that about? And I had read some poets about, had written criticism, but suddenly I just started following them, reading everything I could. And also at that point I had read Ashbery and other people. There's a book of John Ashbery and Joe Brainerd. There's other things where you saw something going on, Alex Katz and somebody else. And I became really interested in that, like, oh, seems like a glamorous life. You get to hang out with an artist and do stuff, and maybe it makes money. Wrong. Nobody wants to buy a collaboration between a poet and an artist because the poet drags the value down. But anyway, we won't go down that lane too far. And it seemed like fun, and one of the things about poetry, which you probably all have been taught, is it's not supposed to be fun. You're supposed to only deal with your suffering, and et cetera, but I came up through a different group of poets where poetry was fun, it was challenging, it didn't have to make sense. Sense is overrated, and I thought, okay, I can deal with this group very well, and that was the beginning. And I just kept looking. I discovered surrealism. No one in America wanted to look at surrealism in the 60s and 70s. I discovered lots of things that got kind of saw as minor. I realized the notion of major and minor is irrelevant, right? I mean, when I was growing up, it was like, who's going to write the next major American novel? Is it going to be Norman Mailer? Or, and there's all these kind of, I thought, ridiculous questions. And so I just went on my way. Little did I know.
What do you think it is about poets looking at art and trying to write a response or write a review that differs from, other people who do that, who may have been trained in art history? I know that for many years there was always a kind of bias that the poets were not critical enough or not doing something enough, that of course theorists and art historians felt like that was their space to occupy. What do you think poets bring to it different than others?
I think poets are intrinsically more sympathetic to being an artist, to being someone in your studio by yourself making work. I think poets are more conscious of the fact that you're trying to describe something that's pretty impossible to describe. That maybe the best thing you can do is point to the work and say what it is that got you. I also think poets tend not to be theoretical in the sense of having an agenda. There's two kinds of critics. There's the critic that has a theory and they attach the art to it and they're driven by the theory, and then there's the critic that's driven by the work, driven by looking at the work, seeing the work, experiencing the work, changing their mind, questioning themselves. I mean, there are times I've woken up in the middle of the night and said, oh crap, did I really say that about that artist? And it's like, why not? Why not have that feeling instead of being so sure of yourself and what you're saying? So I'm willing to live in that weird state of doubt, which you're not supposed to live in because you're supposed to know what you're doing with your life. I'm 74, I still don't know what I'm doing with my life. Except that I wake up every day and try and write something,
Can you remember the first poet-painter collaborations that you saw in person?
Larry Rivers and Frank O'Hara. I also saw I went to a Dada show and I saw stuff that the Dadists did. I got really into exquisite corpses. I really love those. I still totally get excited by them. In fact, I just did I did a whole bunch with I have two people doing my archives, and so I make dinner for them, and we just did a whole bunch of. So I'm willing to do it with anybody. They're like just kids, they're like my grandchildren. So. Why not?
Well, I mean, I'm asking you some questions that I know the answers to, but how you answer is always interesting to me, even though we've done this a couple of times. What was the first collaboration that you feel like you did?
Oh, I did a book called The Sleepless Night of Eugene Delacroix. It was a book of little prose pieces done by a small press. And the man who published it, Larry Zerlin, said, "Oh, you should decide what's going to be on the cover." The person I was living with then, Ray Berolsheimer, I said, why don't you do it? And we talked about it. And so she's a stone carver. She lives near Lake Utica. She does building restoration. And so she was interested in it then, but hadn't committed herself to it. She did the cover. And I think of that as my first collaboration, because she and I talked about it. She did drawings for it and this and that based on the stories, that were in the book.
Uh-huh. What was the first one where you were actively working with an artist?
Archie Rand.
Archie Rand?
So you'll see that I did 26 paintings and a bunch of works on paper. And someone asked me this yesterday, which came first, was it the writing or the drawing? So Archie and I were doing faculty crits of artists and other faculty. I got really bored with what the other faculty members were saying, so then I had some yellow, sheet of yellow paper, and I drew on it something, or I wrote something like, I started making up labels for the faculty. Different kinds of dog food, and then he drew the cans of dog food. So it's like boring faculty dog food, vomits too much dog food faculty, stuff like totally silly, childish. I'm about 13 at that point, and anyway, we leave one day after doing, we get bored. We're just doing this over and over, and I said, "Oh, we should do a collaboration." And Archie Archie's a character, standing in the parking lot, says, "Yeah, we should do 1,000. I went, "Why 1,000, Archie?" And he goes, "Because that way we'll get beyond whatever we know." And I've never forgotten that. I've always thought that was the goal, to get beyond what you know how to do or what you know how to say. And so we started off very simply, when I was a child, there's all these things like Yellow River by I.P. Daly, these really stupid, childish book things. So I just started doing book titles. And then I went through A is for, B is for. I just started going through little lists that we all have in our head. And after a while, I was nowhere. I didn't know what was going to come next. And that was when I think we took off. So the way we did it was we sat was living upstate, at a dining room table. He sat at one end with a pile of art books and just started making watercolors. I sat at the other end and wrote on pieces of paper, and we just passed them back and forth. And basically it was all one hit. I would give him something, and it became competitive, like who could go faster. And I think that was actually helpful, because then you thought less, or you hesitated less. And I think there's that Allen Ginsberg first thought, best thought, which I thought, no, I'm never going to be that kind of writer. But there I was, writing completely silly, ridiculous things and not questioning whether it made sense or not, right? You have to be willing to look foolish, not be embarrassed, just whatever, and just kind of let go of all of your little voices that say, oh, you can't say that, don't do that. And that's how a lot of them, and I don't know if we did 1,000, but we certainly did more than 500. And they're under the bed.
Yeah, you said last night that when I approached you about wanting to do this show, which I can tell a little bit about how that came about, that yes, these were things that were like under the bed and in the box and in the closet. And when you said it last night, I thought that really comes off as it wasn't, like it could be interpreted as it wasn't important. You know what I mean? Like I did it and I put it away. But I think like the spirit of it needs to be discussed, which was, it was about being present and not necessarily having an agenda. Like, you didn't really think about, here I am with my artist partner, and we're doing something that we're going to exhibit and is going to be meaningful. It's like you were being in the moment with each other, right?
Right.
And so part of the part of the way that the works came about were decidedly uncommercial. There was no goal for it to be like a product for a market. It was, we're doing this because we'll see where it leads us, right?
Yeah.
And that pretty much was the spirit under which you've done a lot of your collaborations.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But I mean, there was a show, Archie had a show on the top floor, Phyllis Kind, and there was a basement. This is when she was on Green Street, and we showed about 40 of our collaborations, and one of them was I wrote Mark Rothko Don't Know, and it was all orange and red. And of course, reviewer, Valentin Tatransky, why would I remember that name, was completely negative. He said I didn't know grammar, on and on about the fact that I had attacked Mark Rothko. And it was just like, wow. And so, of course, that didn't help. And Phyllis never wanted to show our collaborations again. You know, it was an embarrassment, blah, blah, blah. And then we did have 2 shows in a small gallery in Detroit. I forget the woman's name, but she sold a bunch. So there was moments where you get a little attention, some of it negative, and that was a lot for me. You know, I mean, as a poet, you hardly get reviewed. So here I am having a show of collaborations, and even though it's negative, it's attention. I thought, oh, that's interesting, you know. I made an enemy.
So I want to ask you about your work with Norman Bloom in particular, because Norman was part of that great legacy of American poet-painter collaborations, having done this very well-known series with Frank O'Hara. So I want to ask you about that one, especially because I feel like the weight of what had been done by Norman and Frank could not have not been in the room on some level. So I want to ask you about how it came that you were working with Norman and how that felt.
Oh, well, he had a studio about this big in the Hamptons, and I would go out there on weekends and hang out with him. And he, at that point, he had not had a show in 12 years in New York, and nobody wanted to show him, and I was completely, the discrepancy between him and, say, someone else seemed too great. And so we were hanging out talking about his work, and at one point he said, let's do a collaboration. And he knew that I knew the ones he had done with O'Hara. And he said, I did those on butcher block paper. They were all done in, you know, black and white. So we're gonna do it on nice art paper, and we're gonna use acrylic, and we're gonna have color. So he immediately brought up the history of what he had done and how this is gonna be different. And I was like, oh, great, you know, this is, but at the same time I knew O'Hara was in the room with us. And and then he'd say, you know, Frank and I would listen to the opera while we did this, and then he turned on the opera and started singing because he was fluent in French and Italian. And we just went to work, and we just would do it all day long. And any one that we didn't like, we just throw away. And that was it. It was great. So, yeah, you just have to take it all on. I mean, you just have to say, okay, this has all been done. I'm gonna do this, and I'm not gonna be, I'm gonna think maybe it's not original, but I'm not gonna freak out about it. Because the notion of you have to be original seems to me like an unfair pressure on everybody. I mean, on the artists. So that's not the problem. Yeah. That's not the issue.
So one of the things that I was
or the notion looking for your voice. I hate that. You mean I only have one? Yes, and you have to find it. That's crazy. If one of your poetry teachers tells you that, tell them they're wrong. And then I said so, and they can write me a letter about it. It's totally ridiculous. Okay, go ahead.
All right,
Sorry.
so trying to stay present in this conversation, how do you think you found your voice or voices, either in your poetry or your criticism?
Well, in my poetry, I'm really interested in multiple personality disorder. Okay, so you have many voices in your head, and you're supposed to really only listen to the right one. But when you're in a room writing on a piece of paper, it doesn't matter which is the right one. I'm interested in the spectrum and different ways people interact with the world and what languages they use. I'm really interested in Oulipo, which is a group of French writers and mathematicians, where the mathematicians made up these rules that the writers follow. And the most famous is Georges Perec writing a novel. It's translated called Avoid, and it's to write a whole novel without using the letter E, which if you know French is not so easy. So I'm really interested in taking language, which is a system, and then making another system within it from whatever possibility. And then there's the Whitman, he wants to embrace everybody, but he's slightly racist and has a few other problems. So what would it be like to extend Whitman to actually embrace everybody, including those that even he would not have ever embraced, in terms of speaking? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, you told me at one point in many of our conversations that you had studied dramatic monologues.
Yeah, I did. When I was in Bard College, one of the things that they, when you became a junior, is you made up your own class or course. And I was really interested in, because I'd studied fairly closely, and I didn't know that at this point when I was studying him, that he was not supposed to be studied, was Ezra Pound, who was, a fascist late in his life. So anyway, you're supposed to study Robert Frost and T.S. Eliot, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, I took a lot of courses on Ezra Pound, and Ezra Pound refers often to Robert Browning, who's really kind of the beginning of a certain kind of dramatic monologue. And so, I won't give you the whole class on Browning and this and that, but it's the notion of Browning's figure is in the middle of an action, and that's the poem, and that person is speaking, and as you read the poem, you discover that maybe he's lying, or blah, blah, blah. Anyway, I got really interested in this voice, the notion of a voice that's not my voice, it's a voice made up. Browning picked historical figures, or figures that could have been in history, but I was just interested in the voice, so I asked this teacher if we could do a class only on dramatic monologues in relationship to lyric poetry. And we just read every week. She'd give me, or I'd give her a group of poems, and we'd go through them line by line. So I really learned how to take a poem apart, and yeah, that's what I did. And it took me a long time to get that into my own work. I'll just say that I had studied this thing, this way of writing or reading, but in my own poetry, I would say, I started publishing when I was in my early 20s. It was not till I was in my late 20s that it clicked. And I suddenly thought, oh, I'm speaking in a vernacular voice that's not mine. And that's when I feel like I became a poet.
So I asked you about voices and the kind of, potentially more than a singular sensibility. Maybe you can talk about this, because it came out for me a lot in reading your poetry, I was saying this to folks last night, that in order to do this exhibit, once John revealed to me that he had done this amazing range of collaborations with well-known artists and students and painters and photographers, it really is, an unbelievable scope of who he's worked with and how he's worked with them. And I felt like I'd read up until, 5 or 6 years ago when this project sort of got launched, and certainly in the last few years, that I had read a lot of John's critical writing. I'd read all of his books. I'd read a lot of his reviews over the years, and I'd read some of his poetry, but I hadn't done the deepest dive into the poetry in a way that I felt like I needed to in order to really understand how these collaborations operate and what was the relationship between his critical writing, his poetry, and his partnering with artists. And when I read the poetry deeply, and I said this to him at one point, I was like, I didn't really know that your poetry was as funny as it is, as sad as it is, as mad as it is, but also how informed it is about your navigation of identity and how much biracial identity informs this work, how much an attitude about how and what way do I fit in to my family, to other families. Can you talk a little bit about some of that?
So my father is born in New York City. He never told me about his family. I mean, so little I could fit it into this glass. He was half English and half Chinese. So being born in 1921, half English and half Chinese in New York City is rare. And being biracial at that point was rare. So I would only discover, this is sort of a sidetrack, about my father when a provost from the University of Bristol wrote me an email and said, would you like to know that your grandfather was the first Chinese person to graduate from the University of Bristol in England? I was like, So this is how I find out about my family. Strangers writing to me. This happened with my mother. This happened with so many people. Anyway, my father was always uncomfortable, and the only other thing that was strong in our relationship where he wasn't trying to kill me was that he read a lot about indigenous people. And he read only firsthand accounts of battles. So he would read these to me when I was 6, 7, and 8. First book he ever gave me was Maurice Sandos's biography of Crazy Horse. And basically he said that no one else belongs in this country. We don't belong here, no one else does. But those people are lying, meaning all of you, sorry. So my father was just an odd, curious, interesting, angry, screwed up man who it took me years to get the good out of him because I was so overwhelmed by the creepy, weird bad in him. And I think that really informed me, the whole notion of what does it mean to belong. At one point I lived in Chinatown in New York City, and I went into a store that I'd been going into for like 2 years to buy some groceries, and the man looks up at me and goes, "Are you Chinese?" And he was Chinese. I went, "Yes." He said, "Do you speak Cantonese?" And my parents were not from that part of China. They spoke a different dialect. I said, "No." He said, "You're not Chinese." So that was really a lot of that when I went to the Forbidden City in Beijing. You have to hand them your passport. So I hand the man, the guard, my passport, and I'm with a Chinese poet friend. And the guy looks at the passport, looks at me, looks at the passport, and this goes on a little too long. And I said to my friend, "He doesn't believe I'm Chinese because I don't look like a Han." And my friend was standing there going, and then finally she goes, "Yes." And then I said, don't worry about it, it's fine. You know, so there's this whole notion of what you're supposed to look like or how you're supposed to look or all these things, and it's really crazy. I mean, I actually, at one point, my first like thick book, I had a photo taken of me where my hair is really long. I have a mustache, I'm smoking a cigarette. And I remember saying to my photographer friend, I'll never get a job in the Midwest once they see this photo. And I didn't. No one ever hired me. What can I say? I came true. So I think you have to figure out how you can live and what you can live with and how to live in this world, which tells you you're supposed to be this way, you're supposed to think this way. I mean, this is all stuff you try to fight against.
Well, and it's the stuff, and when I said what I said about your poetry, it's what I mean that in the best sense, which is you are trying to navigate and interrogate the things that you're just speaking about. How do I fit in? What does it mean to fit in? What does it mean to be one thing or another? Can you be many things at once? Because a lot of the artists, not always, but a lot of the artists that you've championed, or when you've called on institutions to think differently about the stories that they tell, your point has always been to try to create some more space around certain things so that they could be looked at more clearly.
How many of you know the artist Wilfredo Lam? There's a little thing that I wrote in there. So Wilfredo Lam was Afro-Cuban and Chinese, born in Cuba, and he was related to runaway slaves, and his father was Chinese. And the Museum of Modern Art put up a painting of his famously by the coat room of the old museum, and I wrote a piece called Please Wait by the Coat Room. The way they talked about Wilfredo Lam was they said he was the first surrealist to use ethnic sources. Well, first of all, he's Chinese and African, and he's using sources he's familiar with. His grandmother was a Yoruba priestess. He grew up in the Yoruba religion. And then one of the more amazing statements ever made about him was he thought like a white intellectual. Well, there's a goal. And so I wrote about this piece, exposing all the ways the Museum of Modern Art represented him the wrong way. They said it was a work on paper, so therefore it was not an oil painting, without recognizing that you couldn't do a painting on canvas in Cuba in 1944 because all the canvas sacks were used to ship sugar to Europe during the war. So they just misrepresented this man. So I wrote this article in 1988, and they took the painting down and they put it in the basement the day the article came out. And of course, this is before the internet, so nobody said anything. No art magazine, no newspaper. It was just like, oh, they just removed the painting. No connection. And then now, just to announce this, so it's not been publicly announced, but I'll announce it anyway. 2 people from the Museum of Modern Art called me up, said, we want to have lunch with you. We want to tell you something, and it's that Wilfredo Lam is about to have his retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art in 2025. So 37 years after I wrote this article, something happened. And I can tell you at this lunch, I was practically in tears. Okay, so it does happen. You have to be, sometimes it's the long game. You just have to be patient. And things happened after I wrote this article. You know, something happened here, something happened there. I met somebody from Cuba wrote to me. So it was always really slow, but the art world is like a glacier. You know, it moves very slowly, and I'm really happy it's going to happen. And I mean, somebody called me and said, because I told them this, are they going to ask you to do something? I thought, if they don't, they don't. The point is he's having the show. And they told me that every person, the other great thing, I have to say I really like, ha on you, is that they admitted that every collector they called to borrow a painting by mentioned my article. They said, oh, you finally read that article. So I was like, good for them, you know, and they had to admit it, like, yes, we were very slow. So I'm happy.
Yeah, no, that's an amazing thing. And you know, so for those of you who've read John's writing, and I'm writing critical writing maybe more in the last 10 years or 20 years between the Brooklyn Rail and Hyperallergic, as opposed to maybe previous decades at Art Forum or Art in America, you've sort of progressively gotten into the position, which is very rare, where you're able to write about whatever you want to write about. And so some of these positions, I mean, yes, you wrote the article on Wilfredo Lamb, and this was Barry Schwabsky when he was
right,
at Arts.
Another poet.
Right, so Barry
runs
Schwabsky,
the magazine, right?
who contributed to our catalog and is also a poet critic. When he was the editor at Arts magazine, he decided to publish this article by John on Wilfredo Lamb. I would bet at that time no other magazine would have touched that.
He didn't, Wilfredo wasn't having a show, didn't have a gallery, but here's this poet friend of mine, he and I are talking. I said, you know, they got it all wrong about Wilfredo Lamb, and I think I have this really good article. Would you want to read it? And he said, write it, and I did.
So you've progressively gotten to the place, which is very rare and kind of wonderful, where you are able to write about whatever you want to write about.
Yes.
And so you've been able to take positions, as you did in previous decades, and reach an audience and speak about things that are, you know, artists who are canonical, who've maybe not been looked at in a while, as well as artists who've had no coverage whatsoever, as well as, you know, people who are not in the gallery system, but you did a studio visit or you came upon somebody's work and you think there's some value there and you're able to write something. And that just doesn't happen. So, I mean, I think you're aware of the position that you're in.
Oh, yeah.
But can you speak about what, like, you know, with, what is it, what's the Spider-Man thing? With great responsibility, what's the? With great power comes great responsibility. So you're in this unique position to be able to do some things that others really aren't able to do. How do you think about when you choose to write about one thing or another? You know, what's guiding you in your choices?
A sense of history. So with Wilfredo Lamb was really thinking that he had been misrepresented and how to talk about how he had been misrepresented. There's many artists I feel get left out of the situation, and I find out about them, and then I do research on them, and I think, you know, just relatively speaking, does, you know, and this goes back to Norman Bloom, was he really someone who couldn't show for 12 years opposed to Joan Mitchell, who's showing every year? Is it really that big a difference between their work, or is it maybe a little less different, and maybe someone should think about his work in some way? And this is not to say Norman is the greatest artist, you know, I'm just saying, how come we haven't looked at him? What does it mean to look at him? What would he contribute to our understanding of second generation abstract expressionists? And just kind of go through it in a kind of straightforward way. I think, so for Hyperallergic, when I started writing for them, I said, this is what I want. If you can give me this, I'll write for you. I don't care what you pay me, I'll write for you. And the deal was I could write about any artist I wanted, whether they had a gallery or not. I said, if I meet somebody on the street and he convinces me he's a great artist, and I go to his studio and I believe him and I write it down, will you publish it? And they said yes. I said, the only thing, I don't want to be tied to commercial galleries. I don't want to only write about artists that are in a gallery. I don't only want to write about artists that are famous. I don't want to write about artists that have a big gallery. It could be like, I don't know, there's a gallery called Christine Lorello. She's now in the Upper East Side. But when I first saw her gallery, it was in a hallway in a building where I was going to another gallery. And it was basically like a little build out in the hallway with one window, and it looked like a giant phone booth. And I walked past, I went, wait, what's going on in this room? Walked in and decided, I'm not so sure what I'm looking at here, but I'm gonna come back to this space. So I think 3 times later, I saw a show I liked and wrote about it. I mean, I think, if you're only going to the gallery that's gonna give you a cup of coffee and make you feel comfortable, you've really already limited your choices. So that, and then there's other people who I think are really, I follow for 20 years and suddenly no one's looking at them. I think that's just fickle. This person's had a real life. Why don't we honor that real life? So that, and then I'm really interested in Asian American artists that just got ignored. If you look at when Ruth Zhao was in the Whitney Biennial, there were 9 other Asian artists in the Whitney Biennial. And then one year you look at the Whitney Biennial and it's all hip and there's no Asian American artists. And you go, what happened? Did we all go back to China and Japan? What's wrong with this picture? So things like that. Bernice Bing I've written about. I mean, most recently, just to brag, I wrote about a man named David Baker. It's in this most recent Hyperallergic. I met him at a poetry reading. He came, now I meet a lot of people at poetry readings. I do have antenna that goes, this person's crazy, just be nice to them till they walk away. Okay, but this person came up to me, started talking to me, and about an hour later, I thought, I'll go to a studio. And we started talking again after the reading. I said, here's my email. If you want me to come to your studio or have a coffee, let's do it. And he wrote me a few days later, and then I went to a studio and wrote about him. I don't even know if he's read the article because he's not on social media. I said, so do you have a website? No. Are you on Facebook? No. Are you on Instagram? No. I went, he's interesting. Let's find out about this guy. Had no idea. And so the only reason he talked to me was in 1991 or 92, he was in a group show of 15 artists, and he was one of 2 painters I said was interesting. And he's held on to this little sliver up till when he met me. 5 years later, he got a really negative review. Really devastatingly negative in the New York Times, and he stopped showing. And he hadn't shown since 2001 or 1997. And he moved out of New York and bought a little schoolhouse and has lived in there and painted his whole rest of the time. He's so interesting because at one point, so some people in Thomas know you're a painter. No, I've painted with my shades down this whole time, and I tell people that I'm not a painter. I don't tell anybody that I'm a painter. I went, oh, he's really interesting. And then I had to write about him. I've exposed him. He's probably pissed off. Why did you tell people I'm a painter? You never know what someone's response is going to be. He could be pissed off at me and write me mad letters for the rest of my life, but I don't care.
So
He's out there.
I want to come back around to something, but I want to take a quick derailing. So here you're talking about writing about somebody who's, practically invisible and wants to be, seemingly.
Right.
Can you talk for a minute about almost the polar opposite situation, which is you're writing about an artist who everybody thinks they understand, and coming to think about his work in a way that you felt everybody had gotten it wrong? And in this case, I'm talking about Jasper Johns.
We talk about Jasper Johns, also about Andy Warhol.
And Andy Warhol, true. So when you decided to write about both of those artists, you were pretty convinced that there was a lot missing in the interpretation and the situationing around these people and what they did. Can you talk a little bit about that experience?
Sure. Warhol, so there's a famous painting by Warhol. It's him, a self-portrait in camouflage. He's kind of, and so everybody's talked about that painting one way or another. It seems to me his dilemma is that he's a queer man who wants to be seen as a straight guy, or normal, whatever that means, right? What does normal mean at this point in the world? And I thought that the self-portrait was really revealing because he wants to be hidden and he wants to be noticed at the same time. So I just took that, I took a few other things. He famously did the painting before and after, where it's based on a newspaper ad of a nose job, where there's the before and there's the after. Before, you're living, you don't like yourself, and then after, everybody loves you and you like yourself. That seems to me really Warhol's dilemma. He wanted to get to the after. He wanted to be loved by everybody. He's a man who made a whole series of prints about Native Americans, in which he includes John Wayne. Hello, what does that mean? What does it mean to really want to be loved by everyone, right? And there are people in this world, you all met them, some of them are movie actors, some of them are politicians, they want to be loved by everybody. Someone who wants to be loved by everybody, don't trust them. So I just decided to write about Warhol, and then at the same time, I went to the Johns retrospective at the Whitney in '76, I had read everything I could about Johns, and nothing that I read made sense to what I was experiencing. At the same time, I had no words for what I was experiencing, so then I decided I had to figure out what was going on. And then when Johns changed, around '81, and became more of a trompe-l'oeil figurative painter, most of the art world didn't like it. And I thought, oh, this is really interesting. And I started writing about it. And I've been writing about him ever since. And I think, so a lot of people think he's obscure or he's hiding himself because he's gay. And I think, you know what? An artist doesn't want to become public and hide himself. That just seems like a weird contradiction. And so I just kept thinking, if he's so new, then we maybe don't understand what he's up to. And maybe what he's up to is actually fairly accessible, not completely. Why should anybody be completely accessible? And I just proceeded on that way.
Yeah. It's really amazing to read books about people that you think you have figured out or that everybody else has figured out, and their positions have been solidified and codified, and then you read something that kind of cracks your whole interpretive space open, and you've done this more than a handful of times. I guess I want to come back around and then leave some time for questions maybe, but I guess I want to ask you, because it seemed very clear to me in reading the poetry, much of it that I had read before and a ton of it that I hadn't, just how fluid the space is between your work as a critic, your interest in visual art and films and books and all kinds, like how much all of that seeps into your poetry. You know, I was blown away by just the kind of merging, mixing porosity between, you know, a piece of critical writing on an artist or an interview with an artist or John's manipulation of an artist's statement into a poem. Like basically, it's like this big stew of stuff that can go in multiple directions.
Yeah.
But I want to ask you about, now there's, you know, 4+ decades of collaborating with artists. How do you think the collaborations with artists have informed your writing?
They just made me more relaxed and more willing to not censor myself. You're in a room with somebody else and you write a stupid sentence or what you think is a stupid sentence and he laughs at it or she laughs at it, then you think, oh, I have an audience of one, how many more do I need? You know, so it's a way that each person gives permission to the other person, which I think we're always trying to get permission or give ourselves authenticity or agency. And we live in a world that does not want to give us any of that. So how do you go about getting your permission or your agency, I think is really like a question that you have to deal with all the time. And I think with, you know, with collaborating, it gave me a certain agency and a certain permission in that moment of doing it. Right, because there's, I mean, a writer who's not so well known anymore, but a wonderful writer, Ronald Sukanik. He and I went out to lunch, and he said, "Oh, we were talking about becoming a writer," and I'm like 24, and he's published like 6 novels, and he goes, "You become a writer when you become embarrassed and you keep going." Oh, okay. But what is embarrassment, right? What are we embarrassed? I mean, we have to think about that. What are we embarrassed about? What is embarrassment? When do we reach it in our work? And how do we go past it? I mean, there's the confessional poet where you think he or she's telling you everything, but then there's also, right, and then you think, oh, this person will never be embarrassed by anything. They'll say anything in a poem. There's the other notion, which is a kind of psychiatric notion, is anything you say is an evasion of something else, right? So there's this dual thing of what you're trying to say and whatever you're saying, is it an evasion? And what is it an evasion of? So having been involved in the talking cure for 30 years is one of the things I do think about. Is, you know, what are we evading? What am I evading and what am I getting to? And how do I try and do both? If that makes sense. I am schizophrenic, I'll tell you that right now.
Would you like some
it's
questions?
just questions.
Does that make sense?
He's happy to answer them.
Yes, I have a microphone. We're going to use the microphone for the questions so that the camera recordings can pick up the questions. We have a hand up over here.
Hi, my question is kind of a silly one to start us off. Do you have a favorite word as an author, or just even a favorite word of this week?
No. But I have words that I don't want to use too often, like cloud or blue, like kind of poetic and a little bit ambiguous, you know. Those are easy words for me to fall into, and then I go, oh, don't do that, you know, so.
Thank you. Questions?
But that's not a silly question.
Daniel?
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, like, so you talked about having an audience of one, and you talked about writing about, the article you talked about the artists who may or may not want to be known. It was really interesting. I read it because I was thinking, I have no idea, I've never heard of this, and it was really interesting as a reader to then be introduced to this person. Do you think about, in that instance, who you're addressing?
Oh, yeah.
like the Wilfredo Lamb is like, I'm addressing MoMA, or like, do you think about that?
Yes. So with poetry, it's really, I try not to think about an audience, so I think that can be a hindrance. But with art criticism, I'm definitely conscious of an audience. I know that I have readers. I know people read me. There's some people who've written letters to me. Some people say they bought work because of me. So there's a sense that I have an audience. I don't want to like take it too seriously, because then it's like, oh, look, I could do this, blah, blah, you know. But at the same time, I am addressing something in my mind. So with Wilfredo Lam, I was addressing William Rubin. I was saying, you got it wrong, and I'm calling you out on it. And his response was great. He took the painting down. So I did call him out. That's how I looked at it, even though I thought, you know, maybe he would have written me a letter and said, screw you, and we could have had a conversation, but that was not going to happen. Say, this artist, David Baker, I'm addressing the art world. I'm saying, how come he got left out, right? Because the prominent New York critic said, these paintings can't stand on their own. And then just the statement, what does that mean, that a painting can't stand on its own? Right? What's holding it up? And why is it you that decides what holds this painting up or not? So that's who I was addressing. And I was addressing how does someone go 30 years not being noticed? Now, partly it's his volition, right? But partly what happened? And I'm just curious. So I kind of I try to ask questions where I don't know the answer. I try to address the artist himself, and I also try to address this audience that I know reads me. Like, look what happened. If this can, and you know, theoretically, let's say I'm thinking, if this can happen to A, it can happen to other people. Let's think about how we look at art. And that's basically, I think, what I'm doing, you know. I mean, and it's fun. You know, I mean, it's fun to have this man come up to me and sit there and tell me, you know, that he's read me and blah, blah, blah. But at the same time, you don't want to take that, you have power. I have to admit it. I can't say I don't have it. But how do I take it and use it is what I think about a lot. Is it for my own aggrandizement, or is it for him? Of course, everything I publish helps me, right? I can't say, oh, I'm totally altruistic. You know, I'm not going to say that. So if it does help me, how does it help me? Well, I'm putting together a book in my head. And this book will help me, but it'll also help the people I'm writing about. I'm not gonna claim sainthood here. So, and you know, frankly, I think I'm a really good writer, so I think people want to read what I write. So there's, you know, I have a lot of little ego machines, you know, going along, but that's what's going on. I am thinking of and I'm thinking of history, to be honest, you know, that I'm trying to change it. But I think the point of art criticism is to try and change history, not make it, but change it, you know.
Thank you, John. Other questions? Casey?
Hi, I was so happy to hear what you said about embarrassment, you know, as a liberating and creative force, and because I'm always telling my students that. And I always like to tell them the poet John Wieners.
Oh, I love John Wieners.
When asked about his technique in some interview, said, I just always try to say the most embarrassing thing.
It's true.
So I guess I just want to exploit your take on that a little more. Give me some more wisdom. Why is embarrassment such a powerful, force?
What is it you're trying to protect when you're embarrassed? You're trying to protect yourself, and I'm trying to figure out what is it you're trying to protect yourself from. You know, I mean, John Wieners. Well, I read him when I was like 17 or 18, and he has this great line, which I didn't understand. I think I was 17, He said, and he's gay, and he says, when women find out you've kissed men on the lips, they never want to kiss you anymore. And I didn't know what that meant. I was just like, what does that mean? And it took me a while to, get it. But there were things that he would say I would just puzzle over. And there's that great poem of him seeing his mother in the subway, and then his mother said, "Oh, for Christ's sakes," because she's embarrassed, and he goes, "What does Christ have to do with it?" I mean, he's so tender and understanding of his mother, who's, not so easy to deal with, and he'd gone in and out of institutions, and I just thought, he doesn't feel guilty, right? And I would say the difference between him and Robert Lowell is that Robert Lowell always feels guilty. And it's like, why do you feel guilty? What is it makes you feel this shame? Whereas I think, in a way, Wiener's, and I'm generalizing, but I think Wiener's feels less shameful. And he had a much harder life. They both lived on Beacon Hill. I happened to grow up on Charles Street, so I know every place that Wiener's lived and every place that Lowell lived. I read both of their poetry starting when I was 16. I could tell you every single place that Lowell passed in his poems, and I could literally walk there blindfolded right now. And so I was immersed in this world, and I remember thinking that Lowell, he thought he was chosen in terms of his Brahmanship, in terms of the family he was born into. And I felt what really is, it's all accident. You're Robert Lowell by accident. It's not divine. You're John Wiener's by accident. There's no difference between the two of you in that. It's just the circumstances are different. And my mother came from a very, very well-to-do family, kept telling me that it was God made me born. And I just had to reject that. I had to early on go, no, I'm not different from other people in that way. It's all circumstance. There's no divinity involved here, right? So that helped a lot. And reading people like Wiener's or Creeley helped a lot, So, and also Creeley was one of the most generous people in the world,
Thank you, John. We have time for one or two more questions. Back to Cameron.
So you mentioned a little bit sort of like you have this deep understanding of the power you have with your writing and your writing about other artists, but at the same time you're making all this like really fun, silly, free art. And how do you, in your practice, balance the heaviness of having all that responsibility and that power with like just wanting to make things that are just like, like the chrome gibbon or all the other pieces in there that just come off a little silly, like the P of life,
right.
Stupid. Like that's my favorite piece there. How do you balance that levity, I guess?
I just don't want to take myself too seriously all the time. Take myself seriously when it's important to take myself seriously. Like when I'm writing about an artist, I'm responsible to a lot of things, including the artist. Whether I like this work or not, I have to be responsible to that, what it is I feel, but also to that person. So one of the things my editor does point out every now and then, and I'm glad that they do this, is I'll be critical about someone in a review. I'm being positive, and then I'll think of something critical to say about someone else, like better than so-and-so. And my editor always says, do you really want to say this? And I go, no, I don't. This is a barroom talk, or this is me hanging out with a friend. And then I take it back. So that's really helpful. And I love my editor for this. I thank her every week. And I mean it. But then when I'm in my desk writing poetry, I'm only responsible to myself. And if I look foolish or I say something silly, so what? Right? Do I have to sound like a poet all the time? What does that mean, right? I mean, the poet's also the fool in Shakespeare, and I'm willing to be the fool, as they say. So I think that's what I mean by multiple personalities, right? That you can be different for every task and kind of apply the whole of your being to that task, but be aware of it and what it is, you know. Yeah, at least, if not more.
John, I have a question. So we talked about you have agency writing for Hyperallergic Weekend. You talked about you are able to sort of chart a course for yourself. You are thinking ahead. You talk about history, the history of art criticism. So starting with Diderot and going to Ruskin and up to Greenberg, are you also thinking about correcting any wrongs of the history of art criticism, or are you focusing on charting that course ahead?
I suppose. I mean, I grew up, when I got to New York, it was all color field painting in Greenberg, or painting was dead. And it was so interesting to me that this notion that painting was dead, because in the late 60s, there was this whole notion in the literary world that the novel was dead, right? The novel's dead, and then 100 Years of Solitude was published, and then everybody shut up and said, oh, maybe that's not where we're going to go anymore. And they all suddenly had amnesia, right? My feeling is this notion that anything is dead is really crazy. You know, who are we to pronounce that? That's really, I mean, there are certain things that are dead. Certain kinds of industries should be changed. Let's talk about all that stuff. But in terms of art and poetry and, you know, none of it's dead. It's all up for grabs and in the air, and someone can use it and someone can figure it out, you know, and it's just whoever that person is, right? It's the brothers Quaid doing stop motion action film, the simplest way to make a movie, and they do these brilliant films for a while. So nothing's, you know, it's all up for grabs. Am I thinking about history and correcting criticism? I'm just thinking that I'm adding my voice to it.
And please allow me to indulge myself with another question. Encouragement for those who like writing, enjoy writing, to write about art. And in art psychology, art writing is vital. And regions like ours.
Well, it's totally important. And I think the only thing, so there's a notion that publications are important. I mean, in terms of like Art in America, Art Forum, they're really all kind of dead institutions now. They just haven't woken up and realized they're dead. Really what's going on is blogs and online magazines. And you know, it's not going to make you money. It helps you get published. It helps you learn how to write about art, because the more you write, the more you learn about it. What you really need is a really decent editor who will help you learn. And then I think things can happen. I think that's Hyperallergic. There's two guys, Vecchian and Harag, took a mortgage. They took a second mortgage out on their apartment and started a magazine. And the reason it's called Hyperallergic is because they were trying to decide whether it was going to be an art magazine or a magazine about food allergies. Because one of them had a lot of food allergies, and then he realized that maybe art would be better, but they didn't change the name.
Wonderful. Stuart, would you like to wrap us up with any questions or?
You know, you kind of gave me a great on-ramp into something that I've been sitting here thinking about, which is, what you just said about regions and places needing people to write about art was really the motivation for me to have invited John to the University of Kentucky several years ago in a series of invitations of poet critics who I really respect, who I wanted to come to our university to talk about their poetry, certainly, but to talk about their interest in art and their writing about art, because I really wanted to kind of goose my community to see this as a viable path. So, because I, like you, in the middle of Lexington, Kentucky, find myself also hoping that there are writers who can cover things at the museum, who can write about artists in our community, who can review things in other venues around town, and there's just not a lot of those people, and there are not a lot of those opportunities for those things to be published. And so it was really selfish on my part to want to have invited John to come to talk about all these great legacies that he knows about, and to be sitting there with my colleagues and students and faculty and kind of like hint, hint, like somebody in this room might want to give their class a challenge to come over to the art museum and write a review, and I don't care if it's critical, I want somebody to be able to chew on what we're doing over here. And in a couple of cases that happened with faculty who encouraged certain writers, and they went on to get some stuff published, which was great. But what John just said about blogs and zines and other kinds of formats, those are things that you don't have to wait for somebody to give to you. Those are things that you can do on your own if you're interested. And what's interesting about, you know, the art world, but probably the music world and probably every other world, is nobody is waiting around for the next bar band, you know, like you have to make yourself necessary. And if you do something that contributes something, even if you're like we're going to do a show in a hallway, we're going to do a show in our home, we're not going to wait for Stuart or Scott or somebody else to give me a show. I'm going to organize one with my friends in my house and invite Stuart and Scott and Daniel and whoever. Like, there's a certain amount of energy and push that you can do yourself. And learning how to write, reading good writers on art. Like, if you're an art student in the school and you're trying to have a life after you graduate, imagining that you're going to make your work and try to sell it or show it or get grants or whatever, at some point you're going to have to write a statement, you're going to apply for something, and what words you use and what descriptions you use to talk about what you do. This is how I learned this. There is no better way to figure out how to write about what you're trying to do than read really good writers writing about what other artists are doing. Find the right word, find the right phrase, find the right reference that helps you build arguments or advocacies. And, you know, in a lot of ways, that exhibit that, you know, I curated, and John was, you know, a great collaborator in this, to make a show about collaboration was a thing that I, as a curator and as a museum director, felt like this is something that I want to do, that I believe is important, which feels no different than what John is saying about writing about artists that he thinks
and
are
getting
meaningful.
edited. I love editors. I mean, I just was edited by a museum, the High Museum in Atlanta, woman, on a Korean artist, and I wrote her a letter. I just said, I think you really helped make my essay better. And I think she was freaked out. She's like, people don't write me this. I said, well, they should. You make my writing publishable. You help me get better, you know. And I think it is a collaboration. It's not like every writer is just like pure God spirit came down and put the words on paper. I mean, it's editing even as a poet with your publisher. It's a kind of collaboration. So I feel like that's something we don't kind of acknowledge enough, you know, that whatever you do, someone helps you, right? You deal or whatever. It's all a kind of group activity, and you decide this is your family, and this is your group, and this is who you want to belong with, you know. And You may have arguments, but every family has arguments.
John, would you like to take us out with your not favorite words of the week?
Theory.
Thank you, everybody. Please a round of applause for Stuart and John.